Sophie, thank you so much for joining me. This is awesome.
It's a thrill to be here. Thanks, Russell.
I loved your book, Feather Trails. It was one of my top books of the year, top two or three books of the entire year. I loved it, and I just can't wait to talk about it.
I'm thrilled that you liked it. I think that's amazing. I really am excited about that.
I know, and the book and your newsletter have inspired me to care more about birds and bird watch a little bit. And certainly, as I go for my walks in nature, pay more attention to birds and the sounds and the sights I see as I go about those walks.
That's fantastic. That was one of my major hopes in writing this book is just to see if I could interest more people in the world of birds by writing about my adventures with birds and my dealings with them. So that's exactly what I had hoped would happen.
Let's kick off my questions. I'd love to just hear you talk about your career with birds and just what your favorite role with birds has been.
I've been lucky to have a lot of years in the field with birds, researching them, conserving them, and reintroducing endangered birds to the wild. And I think that reintroducing birds to the wild has been the real highlight. Whenever I was out there helping these really rare endangered birds get back out in the wild and make it, I always felt like I was doing something really of worth, something of value and something important. Every day I was out there, it felt meaningful and important. And I really loved that. It felt like I was doing a critical thing to help the planet, to help our bird life, and to help all those who care about birds by getting these birds back there in the wild. And I also loved it because when you are working with endangered species, there's often very few individuals left. And I came to know the individuals that I was working with really well. And when you get to know individual birds, a lot of them have really unique and different personalities. And so it was so much fun to get to know them. I, of course, became very attached to them. And I try to convey some of the stories of my experiences with these different individuals in Feather Trails.
So, why do you think we humans are attracted to birds? Why do we feel this connection to birds that we don't feel for any other animal except maybe our dogs and our cats?
Exactly. It's funny because a lot of people say that it's because we're drawn to their ability to fly. But for me, it's their color and their sound. Birds are beautiful. They fill our world with music. They're these fragile, delicate creatures, and yet they do these amazing feats like migrate over hundreds of miles of water. They connect us to different parts of the world through the magic of their migration. And I think for me, one of the things that really attracted me to the bird world was that their whole lives are often on display for us. I first
Hmm.
was interested in mammals, and I wasn't a big bird person initially, and I especially liked small cats. But I realized that if I ever wanted to work with small cats, they're usually nocturnal or they're hidden, they're cryptic. A lot of mammals, their lives are hidden from us. They're in the dark or we just don't see them. But with birds, you get to see them feeding their young and fighting over territories and singing to proclaim their territories. So I feel like
Hmm.
they're so visible and they live all around us. And so it's much easier for us to see
Hmm.
them and appreciate them and experience their lives alongside ours. So for me, that's a big one.
What do most people get wrong about birds? What do they not understand about birds? What do they miss about birds?
A lot of people aren't aware of how many birds are around us and the variety and the diversity. Until I really started getting into birds and studying them, I had no idea how many different birds there were around, living their lives around us. And I think
Hmm.
that we take for granted that they'll always be there, no matter what we do, because they're pretty resilient, but we could push them to a certain point where a lot of their populations are declining, a lot of them are not doing well. So it behooves us to take notice of them and help them out when we can.
You mentioned some of the bird personalities, Sophie, and there were some moments in your book that I laughed out loud, cracking up about. You saw a
Uh,
bird do this or that, or you had an interaction.
yeah.
Tell us about the funniest thing that's happened to you as an ornithologist.
A lot of it is working with some of these birds that are very charismatic. I think I used to just laugh working with California condors so often. And you wouldn't think that a big, ugly vulture would be that appealing. But when you work with them, you discover that they're really playful. And so they were often playing tug of war with things. Anytime they saw an empty water bottle on the beach, they would have to punt it like a soccer ball and they would just chase after it and they'd fight over these fun toys. And I always knew that if there was a collection of condors in an area, they'd either found some food, a carcass, or else they'd found a bunch of really fun toys. And I remember once at Grand Canyon, this garbage can had blown, the contents had blown over the canyon, and I went to the edge of the cliff rim and looked down, and it was just a play fest of condors. One of them was standing on the lid, and the other was trying to drag the lid. Another was punting a water bottle down the slope and leaping over bushes to get to it. So it just was crazy. It was just a total play fest. So that I think is, one of the times I've laughed the most and have enjoyed the birds is when they're doing these incredible weird interactions and just playing, which is amazing.
I mean, it sounds like we should have them over and like open presents under the Christmas tree. It'd be like having more kids.
I think they would love it. They are just so into playing with anything that they can get their beaks on. So, that's just a fascinating aspect of birds. Also, some of the funny things, I think birds are, they allow you to laugh at yourself and not be too overconfident, because I remember having some funny moments in my life with just incredibly bad calls that I've made. I remember once being all excited going to a wildlife refuge, and I was with a friend and I said, "Oh, an incoming flock of ducks." And he looked at me and he said, "Sophie, those are blue jays." And in my enthusiasm at the moment, I just completely blew it. But we all often do when we're watching birds. There's challenges out there. We get over enthusiastic or we don't see something the right way. So we can all make mistakes and remain humble while doing it. So I've laughed at myself at times.
So I have to ask a kind of snarky question, which is you love birds so much. That is evident in our conversation already. It was very evident in your book. I'm just curious. Are there any birds you can't stand? Any birds you hate?
I guess hate might be a slightly strong word, but I do have to confess that there are some birds that I don't love very much at all. Mainly, and it's not even their fault, but I have to say that one of my least favorite birds is the house sparrow, which is one of our most common birds in cities and towns. And I'm not a fan because it was introduced from Europe and it's really aggressive about getting nest cavities from our birds, and nest cavities are very limited, and swallows nest in them, bluebirds, and house sparrows will go into those cavities, and if there's already swallows or bluebirds nesting in there, they'll sometimes kill the young nestlings and just build their nest right on top and take over the nest. So I don't like them. They are making it much harder for our native birds. Same with
Hmm.
European starlings. That's another introduced bird. So as far as the native birds go, I love them all. Some of the introduced birds, I don't love them because they put so much pressure on our native birds. And it's not their fault. The European starlings do the same thing as house sparrows. They compete for these cavities that are limited. Starlings are at least very smart and they're amazing mimics. So they have those sort of things going for them. Whereas house sparrows just make me cranky when they come around and try to take my bluebird nest. I chase them off and scream at them.
Wow, sparrows, starlings, you have earned Sophie's ire.
I'm afraid they have. So, and it's not their fault. It's us messing with the world a little bit.
Let's turn to the book for a few questions, Sophie. I'm curious, can you update us since the events of the book? Tell us what's going on with the preservation efforts for the peregrine falcon, the Hawaiian crow, and the California condor. How are they doing today?
The peregrines are doing really well by and large. They were taken off the endangered species list in 1999, and they're one of our biggest conservation success stories. Unfortunately, biologists right now are really concerned because we're starting to get a lot of reports of peregrines dying because of avian flu. the avian flu is really wreaking havoc on our bird life right now, and apparently peregrines are getting hard hit by that. So
Hmm.
I'm a little worried about them from that perspective. I'm also a bit worried because we're having a catastrophic disappearance of our insects, and peregrines rely on insects to raise their young. Many birds feed on insects. And so if there are fewer insects, the birds that feed on them are going to be struggling, and there'll be fewer of those, and peregrines depend on birds. So I'm a little worried about the long term, but so far the peregrine has really been a remarkable success story where people got behind it and helped return it to the wild. California condors are doing really well. They went down to 22 at one point, and now there's over 500 of them. There's over 300 in the wild. So that's also a very good success story, but they still require intensive management. Without our help, and without us saving them from lead poisoning, they would go back toward extinction. So they're doing really well, but they're very dependent on our management. And the Hawaiian crow, their situation has turned around recently, and it's very hopeful. And they were, in my book, one of the sort of saddest stories. They've really struggled and had a lot of pressures that they've been up against. 5 of them were just released onto the island of Maui. So it's the first
Hmm.
reintroductions that's taken place in a couple of years. And they put them on Maui, which is not their native island. They are native to Hawaii, the big island. But the Hawaiian hawk, which has exacted a lot of pressure on reintroduced birds, doesn't occur on Maui. So they want to give these birds the best shot they can in the wild. So they've just reintroduced some birds. And so that's really exciting to finally have crows back out in the wild. So that's exciting. And they're also trying a biocontrol to reduce numbers of mosquitoes in Hawaii. And mosquitoes have been a big problem transmitting diseases to the native birds. So there's some good news on all fronts, which is exciting. It just goes to show when we have targeted conservation efforts and really try to help these animals, we're often very successful.
That leads to my next question, something that came out of your book, and especially with the story of the peregrine falcon. When a bird becomes endangered, it sure seems like the 80-20 rule is in effect. 80% of the problem is caused by 20% of factors. And with the peregrine falcon, it seemed even more dramatic. 90-10, 95-5. The overwhelming problem with peregrine falcons was the introduction of DDT and related type chemicals into the environment. The solutions also seem to follow a similar distribution. 20% of the solutions get at 80% of the conservation effort. Again, with the peregrine, getting DDT nixed from the market significantly improved population health. And yet, something that came out of your book is that ornithologists kept pushing on all fronts. You kept hammering on the 80% of the solutions that contributed only 20% of the solution. I found that fascinating, and I'd love to hear from you. Why keep pushing on all fronts, even ones that won't seem to contribute that much to the general benefit, the general result?
You're absolutely right. And one thing I did try to convey in my book is that when there's a bird like the peregrine that is basically declining for one reason, if we don't deal with that primary problem, we're not going to be successful in recovering this species. So we were able to get rid of DDT, and that helped the peregrine. If we could get rid of lead ammunition and replace it with non-lead ammunition, we would take care of the condor. But a lot of the times, those big threats are so difficult for the general public to deal with. It takes agencies, it takes biologists, it takes nonprofit organizations, it takes a lot of entities to work on some of these larger problems like pesticides, like climate change. And right now, we're in kind of an all hands on deck moment with bird declines. We've lost about 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And a lot of us in the general public feel overwhelmed trying to think, how can we help? I can't stop agriculture from using too many pesticides, but I can keep my cat indoors and put decals on my windows to try to protect birds. And so I feel like a lot of what I was trying to do was try to inspire people to take care of those other factors that we can deal with. A lot of birds are disappearing and dying the death by a thousand cuts. There's a lot of different pressures on them. And so the more of us that can help with some of those pressures, and then hopefully the agencies and the bigger conservation groups can deal with the bigger problems. But if the rest of us chip in and help with the smaller problems, then we have a better chance of helping out more birds.
That's an enormous number you just said. 3 billion birds lost in 50 years, basically my lifetime. 3
Yeah.
billion.
Yeah, it's really staggering, and that's something else I tried to convey in my book. It's a hard thing when we grow up. We often look back to our childhoods as this is when there was more wildlife, less development. It was a wilder time. But children that grow up today are growing up in an environment with far fewer birds and much less wildlife than we grew up, and we had less than the generation before us. So there's this sort of disappearing wildlife that we adjust to. And I felt like in this book, I wanted, especially in Hawaii, to be able to show what it was like so that children today know what we should try to work to save, what we should work to try to get back to recover some of these lost birds and lost species, lost habitats.
That leads to a tough question. Can we have our proverbial cake and eat it too? Can we have the benefits of a modern industrialized society? And can we also have a thriving nature earth ecosystem where wild animals can live in some reasonable equilibrium with the human created industrial society?
I think we can. I think it's important that we're clear eyed about our impacts and that we learn about them and recognize and be willing to make changes to help minimize our pressures on other organisms. But what I learned with endangered species is that by helping birds, we often tackle problems that harm us too. It's not getting rid of DDT just help peregrines. That was very beneficial to the environment and to us too. So we definitely benefit by reducing threats to birds. An amazing conservationist said that when we take care of birds, we take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. And a lot of those things are threatening us too. So I think that we can have development, we can have our modern industrial society, but it's valuable that we recognize that we are sharing the planet with other organisms, and by sustaining them, we sustain ourselves too. And some of that is more nebulous, like in addition to birds taking care of pollinating our crops or keeping our insects to a safe number. And birds do all kinds of contributing things to ecosystems, but they also, being in nature is restorative for us. It's healthy for us. There have been a lot of studies that showed that getting out and walking in nature makes us happier, makes us less stressed out, makes us less anxious. I think we can find a balance there where we can continue to live the lives that we want, but also nurture and sustain the wildlife that enriches our own lives and also shares some of the problems that we face too.
What's next in the world of bird protection? What's the frontier? It undoubtedly involves technology in some way, shape, or form. What's that look like? Sort of better processes are out there. Tell us about the frontiers, the leading edge of your world.
I think there's so many of them. There's so much research on birds because they are so visible and vocal. There's always a lot of research on them because they're easier to study. But I know that people are focusing more on their entire life cycle, not just, oh, they're here in the summer or in the spring, but many of them migrate huge distances and winter in the tropics. So people are starting to look more and more to what their wintering habitat is like, what's happening down there, and also what's happening to the habitats that they stop over and refuel when they migrate. And so there's been some amazing new research, and technology is key. For example, there's a new thing called the MODIS tracking system, and they put these tiny little radio tags on birds and insects, and these towers track the animals as they pass by. So they're able to find out a lot more about tiny organisms like birds and insects as they're migrating. So that's one of the really amazing new kind of frontiers of wildlife and tracking where they're going. And then there's a lot of technological advances that are more subtle, but are really important. Like they're constantly trying to study how to make glass safer for birds. A lot of birds crash into buildings during migration, and there's now different studies to try to make glass more visible to birds to help protect them. There's some things that are less technological but have made a huge difference over the years. Like when you see radio and communication towers that have red lights on them to warn planes. They discovered years ago that birds were getting drawn to these red lights and circling the
Mm.
towers until they were exhausted and dying and hitting the guy wires and things. And there was just a simple switch
Mm.
of making a steady red light. They went from the steady red light to a blinking light, and that really improved the problem. There's
Oh,
a lot of research going on in all different kinds of things, like how are birds being impacted, and a lot of people chipping away at these different things, different pressures on birds.
sound like you were talking about the Modus tracking system. It sounds like every bird is going to get a like an Apple AirTag.
I know exactly. It is a lot
You
like
know,
that. And
yeah.
it's amazing what this technology reveals about these migratory journeys and where these birds are traveling. It's just incredible.
Let's look at the flip side of this coin, Sophie. What's going to be the hardest challenges in protecting birds, saving birds over the next 50 years?
I think it's our ever-growing population and the pressures that we exact on wildlife and its habitat, because we need so many resources to feed and house and clothe ourselves. And I think there's often either an unwillingness or an obliviousness about the wildlife and the habitats around us. Becoming more aware that there is wildlife around us, that they are trying to make a living, is really valuable. But I think it is our ever growing population and trying to come up with creative ways to sustain wildlife and wildlife habitats as our numbers increase.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned in the book so many people, researchers, scientists, ornithologists, organizations. Tell us about one unsung hero in bird preservation, a person, an organization, anybody unsung who's doing heroic efforts to contribute to the effort to save birds now.
I couldn't really think of one person or one organization necessarily, because it does take a village and there's so many people involved, as you suggest, and I try to convey in my book. But for me as a group, one of the unsung heroes are often the field biologists, the people who are out there in the field day to day, working to research these birds, conserve these birds, reintroduce the endangered birds. And it's often the higher ups that are doing the administrative stuff, the policy work, that get a lot of the attention. But they're the people on the ground are often dealing with terrible weather, unbelievably long days. Birds don't take off Christmas and New Year, so they field people work through weekends and holidays and everything else. And I tried to give a thank you in my dedication to the field people, because I think they're often our unsung heroes in keeping our bird life healthy and happy.
That also very clearly came out in your book. You talk about some of the days you had, some of the one thing I want to get to is some of the walks you took, just enormous distances to try to find a bird's nesting place or try to find, unfortunately, the carcass of a bird that you thought passed away or the tracker
Yeah.
hadn't moved for a while. Tell us a little bit about those walks. My newsletter is about walking. I'm fascinated with those walks that you took yourself as a field biologist. What were you thinking about? What were you feeling? What were those walks like?
Those, sometimes the walks had a purpose. If I was looking for a bird that I suspected had died, I was, of course, anxious and hoping I wouldn't find a dead bird and things like that. When I was looking to try to find a bird to see if the birds were nesting, and that was very hopeful. So I was often thinking about what I might find at the end of my destination, but I never lost sight of how much I loved the moment and being in nature and experiencing the natural world around me, because it is really just amazing to be out there in the wild, often quiet. I did take some very long journeys. One thing I really ended up doing a lot at Grand Canyon that I had never expected was hiking at night. It was so hot down in the canyon that we just couldn't get down in there in the daytime. So we had to do our hikes in at night. And that was something I had never hiked alone at night for 12 miles. But I ended up, I would hear the noise the bats, the echolocating bats were making. And it was just peaceful and beautiful. And it was just a magical time to be hiking with very few people around, whereas in Grand Canyon, the daytime was crowded with tourists. Mostly it was just being out there with nature and really enjoying the moment while also sometimes worrying about what I was going to find when I completed my journey.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Tell me about your favorite place to take a walk, period.
My favorite place really is mountain country. I spent my early years in Switzerland and then moved to Vermont, and I just love mountains. And so I think my favorite walks are always along mountain streams or through woods that get me up to a mountain lake. I just love those. I love rushing, tumbling mountain streams, and I love having jagged peaks around me. So I just love mountain country. That's probably my favorite.
It's amazing. That's amazing. This may be a similar answer, but I'm just curious. I've started to ask a few people in life this question, and I'm always fascinated by their answers. But I'm curious, where do you encounter beauty in life?
A lot of it is mountain country. I tried for years. I ended up working with condors in Arizona, and canyon country is beautiful, but it wasn't the same for me. And so I spent years trying to get back to the mountains. And so looking out at a mountain range and the alpenglow, the different light on it at night, is somewhere that I just love. I love seeing the ever-changing light in the sky around mountains. But I think almost wherever I am in wild places, I end up seeing beauty, big and small flowers in the forest floor, or
Mm,
a, a tanager perched up in a tree. There's so much beauty around, and I really enjoy that. And then, I think there's also beauty in our relationships with other people and our pets, our loved ones. I feel like it's not a visible beauty, but it's an amazing, our important relationships with animals and people are a beautiful thing
mm.
too.
That's wonderful. I love it. I love it. Let me ask you a few last questions here, Sophie. Um, just for beginners, and I'm definitely a beginner. What's a good resource for beginners to learn more about birds, bird watching, identifying birds, or just the state of birds, period? What are good resources for people to turn to?
I think there's more and more online things, and maybe it's because I started out years ago, so I'm more old fashioned, but I think it's really nice to have a field guide to be able to look at just how the birds are laid out, comparing birds in an easier format. So I think there's some really wonderful field guides, like the Sibley Guide to Birds is a great one.
Mm,
He has beautiful pictures of birds that are really helpful for identification. I grew up using the Peterson guides. So there was Peterson's Eastern and Western guides. Those are amazing. And a bird person called Ken Kaufman has a sort of book of bird photographs if people prefer to identify
mm.
birds with photographs instead of drawn pictures. His Birds of North America is great. As far as apps go, I think Cornell University has just done a brilliant job with its Merlin app, and they've transformed, the bird world and made it so much more accessible for beginners through that app. I haven't used the identification portion of it because I usually know what I'm seeing, but I do use the bird songs and calls part of it. And so you can be in a place and hear a bird song that you're unfamiliar with and just hold up your phone, record it, and it will tell you what you're hearing. And that's an amazing thing. Even for somebody like me, there's a lot of places I'm not familiar with the birds, or I'm
Mm.
rusty, or I'm confused. And it really is an amazing app as far as telling us what's around us all the time. And I think for new people, especially, sometimes you think, oh, there's probably 3 or 4 birds around, and you hold up your phone and suddenly you're hearing that there are birds singing that you didn't even know existed. So that can be a lot of fun. So I think those are
I
my
mean,
favorite
that
resources.
that that app is incredible. Our mutual friend Bryan mentioned it in one of his newsletters and I got it, and it has transformed my walks in nature.
Oh,
It
that's
is the
awesome.
coolest app. It's
I
awesome.
just
Right.
love
It is
it. And
awesome.
it's a free app and it's phenomenal. Very occasionally it will have a mistake, but for the most part, it is just wildly accurate and it's tremendous. And it
Yeah.
really does open up the world. One of the things as an ornithologist that I loved was learning bird songs, because suddenly you realized how much is around you that you didn't even know was there. And Merlin does that for you.
You mentioned a few books, but I'm curious, besides, of course, your book, what's your what are a couple of your favorite books about birds?
It's funny, I don't have that many favorite books about birds. It's just crazy. And some of them are quite a lot older. My favorites are the ones that sort of started getting me into birds. But one of my favorite ones, there was a woman called Marcy Houle, and she wrote Wings for My Flight, The Peregrine Falcons of Chimney Rock. And it was about her work with wild peregrines. And I think that came out a couple of years before I did my peregrine work. And I think that really resonated with me. And I love the stories of biologists being out there doing the work. So, not surprisingly, that resonated with me. There was another book, this wasn't about birds, called Cry of the Kalahari, about biologists working in Africa. That one had a similar kind of impact on me. So, I must have been drawn to these stories about biologists working with birds. But another book that I really like, there's an author and just an amazing bird person called Pete Dunn. And he actually did the introduction to my book. So that was a
Yeah.
huge honor. But he has a bunch of wonderful bird books. He has a new one out that I haven't read yet, but one of his older ones was called The Feather Quest. And that was the first book where I realized he and his wife went all over the country looking for birds. And it was the first time I realized you could travel and see new birds in new places. And that was a revelation at the time. You can get to know the birds in your neighborhood, but then you travel and there's a whole nother
Mm.
contingent of birds to experience and learn about and discover. And he really made that clear for me. So I love the Feather Quest.
Oh, I love it. Um, you mentioned a couple of ideas about how we private citizens can help birds. My daughters, who are 10 and 12, saw me reading this book and they asked me about it. And then I mentioned that I was going to interview you and talk to you, and they were all excited. So maybe they'll
Oh,
listen to
that's
this
great.
or read this. But they had a question, which is how can they, again, they're not experts. I'm not an expert. What are things they can do to help protect and save birds?
It's hard to think of just one thing that people can do, because a lot of my philosophy is there's many small things that we can do. But I think the number one thing is just to open our eyes and be aware of birds, to notice birds and to learn about them. A lot of us don't realize how much diversity there is around us, how different some of these birds are. They all make a living a different way. And I think if you see birds in your yard, look them up, try to figure what they are, learn a little bit about them. I think as we learn about birds and we observe them, we often come to care more about them, especially when we see them. They're familiar in our backyards and things. And when they become familiar and we know about them, we can share our stories about them. I think that makes us want to help them. And that's a critical first step. Then there's a lot of things that we as individuals could do. Wildlife likes dark places. We can keep our lighting outside darker. You could tell your daughters to turn their lights out when they leave a room, and it keeps the house darker for the birds, or to put decals on our windows because birds often strike windows. Keeping our cats inside is a really big one. That's the biggest pressure on birds is cats. So having your cats indoors. There's just a bunch of small things, but it can be really tiny things like plastic beverage containers. There's a circle there that birds can get trapped and entangled in. So
Mm,
whenever
mm,
I take a rubber band off my fruit or my broccoli or have plastics, you can just cut them so that animals don't get trapped in them. So there's just a lot of little things about being aware that there's a
mm,
wild world around us that could be impacted by our lights, by our cats, by our trash, and
mm.
try to take care of some of those things. It's small stuff, but if there's 96 million of us in the US that watch and like birds, if 20 million of us did some small thing, that's a lot.
Huge difference. Yeah. This has been awesome, Sophie. Let me get you out of here on this last question. I'm fascinated. After your book, uh, what's next for you? What's your next project? What's your next effort?
I'm working right now on a book with a fellow biologist. We've created an anthology of stories by and about women biologists who are doing work all over the country, amazing things working with wolves or crayfish. And it's all their various adventures in the wild, crashing in helicopters, getting bitten by a bear in Yellowstone, dealing with poachers in Panama, dealing with a flood in Alaska. We finalized that book, so I'm working on getting that published. That will be our sort of next step. But I think it will hopefully show young girls and women that it's working with nature and working with wild animals can be an amazing experience, an amazing field, and people really thrive at it.
I love it. I can't wait to read it. This has just been an amazing conversation. Your book and talking with you have really been highlights of my year.
Thank you.
I've loved every minute of it, and I just can't thank you enough for your willingness to come and chat more with me.
It's such a great pleasure. I love sharing birds with people, and it's just so exciting when people are starting to get captivated by that world. So there's nothing better for me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sophie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Russell. Great to talk to you.
All right, great talking with you.